we're living right now, it's an amazingly disrupted world where there's a lot of acceleration as well of things that were already happening and have accelerated in terms of both positives and negatives. One of the amazing positives we've seen is that the reported COVID deaths in countries led by women are less than half than those led by men. There's a study, it's from last year, at the beginning of the pandemic, where 194 countries were analyzed and divided by size. And if you can see this, the small size, they compare male leaders of state, heads of state in small countries relative to Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and you look at the thousands of deaths. So she's done way better than the average male leader. Then mid-sized countries with Angela Merkel in Germany, comparing with the UK, and of course, again, less than half of the deaths in the beginning last year of the pandemic, before the summer. And then a large country, Bangladesh and Pakistan, again, Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh does much better than Pakistan. So these are not randomized controlled trials. We still don't have enough information for that, but they are very powerful indicators that women in leadership positions have done very well. So I think COVID is calling for a different type of leadership. This was already happening before COVID, but it has been accelerated. A leadership that is distributed, that taps on the collective, that draws on the wisdom of many rather than the wisdom of one. And that allows leadership to flow from the bottom up, which is what we need to solve the more and more complex, increasingly complex problems that we have in our life and in our world. And also we need a distributed leadership, which is actually much better place to lead a very rapidly changing world, not just with COVID, but also with technology and all the changes that are happening so fast. What does masculine leadership look like? It's not just men, it's also women. Margaret Thatcher is a very good example of masculine leadership. Many of us have been very masculine in the way that we led in the beginning, because that's all we saw, that's all we knew, and we knew that that would take us far. Bill Gates, Elon Musk are examples, very results-driven, very goal-oriented, following a logical decision-making process, focusing on who is right rather than what is the right thing to do, and looks for individual achievement and personal excellence. That is masculine leadership, and it's present, as I said, in men and in women. What does feminine leadership look like? Again, it's not just present in women. We have here Trudeau from Canada, and then we talked about Jacinda Ardern and Oprah Winfrey. They understand leadership as generating capacity in others. They focus on long-term gains. They use intuition and sensing as opposed to purely rational approach, and values cooperation over competition, something that we're seeing increasingly happen in the world. And they want to work in an environment where all voices are heard and change can happen within the community. So are we saying men are bad leaders? Of course not. We're saying that if we had too much feminine in the world, there would be delay in decision-making, too much focus on relationships instead of results. When there's too much masculine, like today, there's predatory competition at the expense of overall well-being. What we're talking is a world where we can balance the feminine with the masculine, and where we can have within our own selves, as women or as men, a balance between these traits within ourselves and within our leadership teams. So with that very quick framing, I want to introduce Deepa. Deepa is a really dear friend and an admired friend for many years. We worked together in the World Bank many years ago. She wrote a book based on interviews, very much the way she's doing her other 17 books, based on interviews and listening, and really having deep listening. And this was about Voices of the Poor. It was years ago, and it completely changed the way that I saw the world. Not only that, but the president of the World Bank, who was preparing for his annual meeting speech, I will never forget, tore everything down when he found the voices of the poor and used Deepa's work to actually talk to all the ministers of finance and central banks governors to say the poor really want you to invest in their own organizations. They don't want aid. They want to become agents of change. And then Deepa has taken this later and worked with women. She has this very well-known book, Chup and Chup Circles. We circulated to you the TED Talk about that. And now she has a fascinating podcast that I really love on What's a Man, which is the other side of the equation. And it has to be part of this yin and yang that we talked about. So from living in villages in Africa, in Asia, Deepa became, one of the most influential global thinkers, according to both US organizations and Indian organizations. So it's really a privilege, Deepa, to have you back. I'm so glad that you are going to be sharing with us some of your thoughts. Very good. So the question that I have to begin with, Deepa, is how would you define feminine leadership? I just framed it in the way that I define it, but you have a much richer experience through all the work that you've done.
Right. I was reading very quickly what you wrote, and I could not disagree with anything. So I think we're on the same track. To me, if I was to try and summarize it, or at least the differences between masculine and feminine, and the important point you made is that these are not always overlap with males and females. I think that's really important to remember. But in terms of tendencies, it's correct. I think the feminine leadership is much more focused on caring and collectives, and it focuses, really centers the we, not the me. It's not focused on I, me, mine, and my views, my authority, my ways, my rewards, or what I can give to others. It's really, I think that is the core difference. So if you focus on the I, or the masculine, at least at the way it's been practiced in the world largely, it's focused on I. I'm the leader. I make the decisions. It's my way or the highway. And I don't care who gets hurt or what gets hurt in the achievement of my goals. So whether that hurt is on individuals, that pain is on the individuals or the environment or communities, that's externalities in the economist term. It doesn't matter. You discount all that. But the feminine way is much more focused on centering people, collaboration, and its transformation through the strengths of others. I think the one thing that's really important to remember about feminine leadership, it doesn't mean that you sit in a puddle of love and just love everyone. Although love is very important and the different forms of love are very important, it is very decisive, right? But the power of the decision making or the power of the decision comes from centering others and not just you, of really learning, gaining from the wisdom of the collective, and then moving forward rather than just centering yourself. And I think if we continue with the traditional macho masculine way in a very narrow way, we will we have already destroyed the planet and we
Yeah,
will continue to destroy the planet and each other.
yeah,
So
yeah.
what you said, Isabel, about the collective and collective learning is really, really important because in a sense it frees us up from knowing everything and being an expert in everything.
Yeah.
And so it actually makes it easier rather than more difficult.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's why also these coaching circles are so important
Yeah.
because they are about building a collective. I remember, and I want to ask you a question about that. I remember when I was in the World Bank, I had a group of 12 that we met once a month. None of us worked in the same organization, and we helped each other through thick and thin for years. And that was very important for me. So my question for you, Deepa, having been in the World Bank, you were in a leadership position. um, did anything surprise you of what you found out in your research in India about women and the views of women? Um, were you surprised that so little had changed or not?
Very. I think both the work with women and men has been a huge learning experience. I think primarily because the higher you go up in leadership, the greater the number of women who are educated, incomes increase, education increases, that you think everything has changed, right? Women have their rights and women are taking different jobs, women are breaking barriers in every field. Um, so everything looks good from the outside. But what really surprised me was that on the inside, we may still be stuck. And that the higher up you go, the more intelligent you are, the more competent you are, the more difficult it is to accept and even talk about the places that we are stuck. Why? Because I think the two, three things that are really important that I learned from this work is that we've been trained to think it's a personal fault, it's a personal defect, right? So if you feel you're personally defective or you're flawed, why the heck would you share that with anyone else? Right? So you hide. The second consequence of that is everyone feels alone. I'm the only one. So that reinforces the sense of, something is wrong with me, and so you hide. And I think the third thing that came out very strikingly was that there's a big gap, and this includes me, by the way, there's a big gap between my intellectual beliefs and my behaviors. And so what I found was that with women, and these are highly educated women, including sometimes CEOs, women from across fields, architects, lawyers, doctors, in the social sciences, is that because these early learned behaviors are they are strongly overlaid by a sense of what is good and what is bad, what is right and what is wrong. So just having the intellectual belief doesn't necessarily lead to changes in behavior. And that's why, again, the collective becomes really important because when
Yeah.
you realize you're not alone, that if there are lots of other women or lots of other men with the similar behaviors and feelings, then it has to do with systems, it has to do with training, and it has to do with habits. And training means you've been trained to be a particular way, right? So, how can it be your fault? So, I find that very freeing and very important. The
Yeah.
last thing I'd say is that, unlike my earlier work on Voices of the Poor, and actually all the work that I did before that, this work really focuses on people like us. It focuses on the middle and upper classes, women and men who are highly educated, women and men who believe quite deeply in gender equality. And yet, what are the pain points? What are the stuck points?
Yeah. That's exactly where I was going to go with my next question. So I was shocked when I started teaching at the Kennedy School. Very, as you say, elite women, very highly educated, highly competent. And so we had coaching circles. And I remember thinking, oh my God, after 30 years, things don't seem to have changed. Because when it came to thinking about getting married, about having children, the pressure from the mothers actually was still very much there. Okay, you finish your master's, now you need to get married. And a lot of the coaching circles was about you don't have to have children, you don't have to get married to fulfill yourself as a woman. So very much an elite thing. And I see in SEWA, which is an organization of grassroots women, really grassroots women, how the collective helps to change those cultural norms, which are even tougher than the cultural norms of the elite. So, with that, I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the role of the mother, the role of the father, now that you're
Oh my.
working on That's a Man, in terms of this moral sort of truths that we grow up with?
I mean, obviously, the earlier the learning, and you know this so well, Isabel, the deeper it goes, right? And I think obviously what we learn is from the most immediate role models, which is our mother and our fathers. I think it's both. It's very hard to talk in averages. My mother, for example, was very clear on financial independence because she didn't have any. So she raised us with saying, no matter, no daughter of mine, and she's a very conventional middle class Indian woman, but highly educated, but was never allowed to work. And she said, I'm be damned if any daughter of mine gets married before she has an education and has the capacity to stand on her own legs, feet, right? So I got that. So when I came to the US, I was so surprised that so many women, for me, college, going to college and university, getting highly educated was a given. It wasn't a choice, it was a must. But all the other behavioral aspects in terms of how you dress, how you please, I think the most poisonous one, sorry to use strong language, but sometimes I think it's important. I think I talk in my book about 7 habits, right? 7 behaviors or complexes that are make it difficult for women to achieve their potential or achieve how the lives they want to live, whatever it is. In my life, the most poisonous has been pleasing, right? Pleasing, that we're trained very early to smile, not to laugh loudly, but to smile and please. It's still second nature to me. And so I have to become very conscious. And as I've gotten older, it's easier, but pleasing was just a natural state. Now, I just want to spend a minute unpacking pleasing. Why is it so poisonous, right? And so pleasing is pernicious because we actually get rewarded for it, right? So when you please others and others like you, and social media has ingrained it even more deeply, it actually, your hormones change. It actually, you get a high, right? So if you get a high, it's quite addictive. So you keep repeating that behavior. So to give that up is really not easy. It's easy to talk about it. I know for myself, when I was younger, I would get heart palpitations if I said no to someone when I wanted to stop my pleasing behavior. So, but with practice, it actually changes. It becomes easier and easier. The second thing about pleasing, and it starts very early, when you stop a girl uh, from deciding, what dress to wear, what to eat, what to ask, what cold drink to offer, any of these simple things, she's really learning to make a choice, make a decision, between options. So if you kill that off, what I found was that women often find it very difficult to make a decision because the opinions have not been differentiated. They're not encouraged to have an opinion, because if you have an opinion, it's much more difficult to please, because your opinion clashes with what somebody else wants or how somebody else wants to behave, which is also why in most developing countries, and including in the West, early on, age of marriage was much lower, because the more unformed you are, the easier it is to blend into the needs of others.
So, how do you think about? So, pleasing is one of the 7 habits that you talk about. Um, eh, how do you think about women leading in a more masculine organized organization, like where we were in the World Bank? How can you be effective without having to go to the masculine and give up all the richness and the power that the feminine can bring?
Right. I think by having even the same outcomes or better outcomes, which, as you saw, is in the COVID experience, it's so dramatic, right? So um, I think women's leadership in terms of carrying everyone and distributed leadership, so everyone rises to their best potential, is what helps achieve the outcomes of an organization, whatever that is. And it actually becomes easier because you're not there. It's not a command and control environment. The incentives are different. And the incentives are for each, it's more, I think women's leadership is more inspiring everyone to do their best. And when that happens, people rise to their best of their potential and are not afraid of making mistakes, or not afraid. I think this is an important one, of asking for help.
Yeah.
Right?
So in answer to that question, I'm going to come back to the role of men in this. But when I was the a vice president in the World Bank, I thought, okay, this is my last job. I'm not going to go any further on my career. I thought, okay, I've come here learning a little bit about how to lead as a woman, but now I feel, more confident. And I did collective leadership, distributed leadership with all the directors. In the beginning, people were like, who makes decisions here?
Yeah.
And they were taken aback when I was not making the decision. So it's not easy to do that shift. But eventually,
It's not
you know,
trusted.
it's not trusted, and they
It's
think
not trusted.
she
Yeah,
doesn't know what she's
exactly.
doing. She doesn't have a
Yeah,
vision. Where is her vision? But if you hold with that discomfort for a while, eventually the innovation that comes out of that, the
yes,
inspiration that Deepa
yes,
is talking about, that comes from that, is there's no comparison with other parts of the organization that are not doing that. So it takes guts. It takes working on the pleasing. You're not
yeah,
going to please everybody when you make
please,
that big shift.
right,
So,
right.
Deepa, with your podcast, which I love, what have you learned from listening to the men that you have interviewed in the podcast as to how difficult it is for them to help us on this? I mean, they have to probably let go of many things that we haven't even thought about. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think two things. I think we've also made big mistakes. I think in the whole area of women's empowerment, etc., given the fact that men hold power even today, even in the US, it's only about 6% of women CEOs. I think it's important to understand men in their own lives, their inner lives. And we haven't done that. So when I search for research, particularly in India on men, I haven't found anything yet. How can we change 500 million women without understanding the 500 men who hold the power? So I think that's a real oversight. And I think it's really important, if we want to change the millions of lives of millions of girls and women, wherever they are in the world, we've got to understand the men. Rather than, what I talk about is, we've just bypassed the men because we assume they don't want to change, or they can't change, or we're so angry or upset that we say, forget them, let's just focus on the women. So I think that's, to me, that's an important message. Um, what was I've forgotten the rest.
So what have you learned about what would be those levers that we could use in terms of bringing them along, as you say, those
Yeah,
500, even the benefit of the
yeah,
500 million?
right. I think sort of, Isabel, the men that I spoke to, again, and this is kids as well, 7 and 8-year-old boys, they all say they believe in gender equality. In fact, just like women, many of them were angry that I would even ask the question. In this day and age, in the 21st century, why are you asking such old-fashioned questions? So there's goodwill. I think if I was to give you a short answer, I would say I would divide men into three groups. Those who are ready to change and want to change, but don't know how. They're stuck. Those who are afraid to change but could come along with some persuasion, and then one third that have no desire to change, they're dug in. So we should start with the ones who want to change, who want to support women and girls, but the moment they open their mouths, they say something that's considered inappropriate and they're shut down. So I think the first thing was to have more compassion. The second is be more strategic in involving men, because they own a lot, they have a lot of power. And third is teaching them some skills. Leap listening, uh, negotiating, negotiating without slamming, not using power. And I think the third is what I would say, that both for men and women, it's this balance between power and love. that we've gotten wrong. In my book, Chup, I say that power, and in the podcast, in societies like in India or in the US in the old days, but even today, power has been outsourced to men and love has been outsourced to women. And men need to claim and learn how to love and how to imbue power with love, and women have to learn how to bring power back into love. So it's this masculine and feminine in each one of us that needs to come more in balance
Beautiful, beautiful. So
to serve
I've
the
been
world.
going through
Yeah.
the questions that we had received several questions. I think I've gone through everything, but how can we the one that I'm missing? How can we lead by issue and not identity to include different global experiences?
I saw that question. I have a hard
Yeah.
time with that because I think when I think of leadership, it's always by issue. And then
Yes.
what kind of leadership do you bring to that issue, right?
So
And
I think it would be about having the love and the power, and not lead from being a woman, but
yeah,
lead on the power and the love in balance, or outsourcing, or sort of
yeah,
splitting. I think that's
right,
probably the
right.
question.
I mean, this is personally just listening to you. I've really been a lot of the work that I've done has been around young women's leadership, and I've been working with women for a long time and Eileen Fisher in order to kind of work around that. And I realized as you were talking that I think I've been operating under the assumption that men are never going to change. So it's up to us. And even though I ran a boys leadership program and kind of said, okay, young women even want boys to understand what they're doing. I'm curious about how possible is it for men to actually change if they don't have incentive to do so? And then, kind of an inquiry there of, do they actually have incentive? So that was something that was coming up for me personally.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, I think from doing this, there's one other question that I want to address that's been written about women's anger. But let me address your question, Antoinette, because um, I was surprised how much men men are caught in pretense as much as women have been caught in pretense. But they're much further behind because nobody has really systematically poked at that pretense. So what do I mean by that? That men who say they believe in gender equality, when you ask them, what are the words that come to your mind when you think of yourself as a man? It's strength, it's aggression, it's dominance, it's muscle, right? But then when you unpack it further, it sort of falls apart. So there's a divide amongst men in their own schism that they too feel that they have to be a certain, act a certain way to be considered manly, and that what they are longing for is, when you keep digging, it doesn't come out initially, is the caring and the love. Whether you think about it in terms of sexuality or in terms of their lives. So I think, and if you look at the research from schools, caring behavior, caring and kindness can be taught. And there's a lot of research on that. And I think that's a great way of um enabling men and women to be more empathetic and kind, rather than, especially for men, to have only one narrow set of responses, which is aggression or bullying or acting tough. So men are caught in that, many men are caught in that pretend. So I think if there was an opening, we would see a lot more. I think we would see sort of the rise of feminine men and women much faster, rather than waiting for another 200 years if we included men. So let me
exactly.
address the question. One other question, I think it's Bridget. It's gone up on the thing. Is about women's anger. I think that's a really, really important one. that it's definitely, I think, Black women in the US, it's a huge stereotype. Uh, Michelle Obama had to deal with it. And if she has to deal with it, I'm assuming all Black women have to deal with it. I think women all over have to deal with it. In my TED talk, I talk about a father who says, if I don't see you smile, I don't feel happy. So it's just a given that women's presence or girls' presence is meant to please others, right? So it all sort of comes into there. And I think we just have to claim that we have a lot of feelings, emotions. It comes back to emotional literacy and expanding that both in women as well as in men. Men's emotional literacy has been squashed, right? Because uh, in all the cultures that I know intimately, even well meaning gender equal parents tell boys not to cry or get uncomfortable. And so that starts squashing boys' feelings. Not only that, feelings, being emotional is devalued. It's not just don't do it, it's devalued and it's made a woman's quality. So don't act like a woman, don't act like a girl. So that's where the problems. If we start unpacking these things, uh, we see that the sources are very simple and that behaviorally we can change them. And the research on all these behaviors is very clear that it's learned. And just like there's incentive to behave tough and rough, because that's what the environment, that's what everyone imagines the environment calls for. The incentives are also great to show kindness